If you agree that real courage isn't about rank or recognition, but about the ones who refuse to quit when everyone else breaks, make sure to like and subscribe, because this story deserves to be remembered. And before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Maybe it's a quiet room, maybe a long drive home, maybe somewhere far away, but wherever you are, listen closely, because what you're about to hear isn't just another mission story. It's about the night a young woman changed the course of an entire squad, without ever asking for credit. They said the line had gone cold, that the Recon team was finished. The last transmission from that valley came through broken, a half-whisper carried on static. We're facing certain death. And for a while, everyone believed it. Until someone opened the black recorder 3 days later and heard a voice they didn't expect. Calm, steady, female. "This is Lieutenant Jenna Cole," it said. "Mission complete. Extraction not required." What followed was a story no one thought possible. It began 12 hours before that message was recorded, deep in the mountains of Khoraz province, under skies so heavy with smoke that day and night had no difference anymore. Lieutenant Jenna Cole, 28, youngest tactical officer in her division, crouched beneath a collapsed outpost roof with a team that no longer trusted her judgment. The operation had gone sideways fast. Communications jammed, air support grounded, and the commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Brooks, bleeding from a shrapnel wound that left him half-conscious. The men were tense, whispering arguments between gunfire bursts, voices cracking with fear. "We're done," one said. "We move, we die." But Jenna didn't speak. She just pressed her finger against the cracked map laid over the dirt, eyes flicking between the contour lines and the faint echo of distant gunfire. Her instincts screamed that the enemy wasn't ahead, it was already circling. They were being boxed in, one move away from annihilation. "We stay put. We're finished," she murmured finally. Brooks scoffed, coughing blood. "That's your plan, Lieutenant? To die standing?" She met his glare evenly. "No, sir," she said. "To live moving." Outside, rain began to fall, sharp, metallic, like shrapnel against steel. It masked the sounds of their retreat, or maybe it only felt that way. Jenna took point, crawling through mud slicks, her breathing measured, her pulse unervingly steady for someone surrounded by death. She didn't have the luxury of doubt. Every choice meant life or loss. The men followed reluctantly, muttering, half convinced she'd get them all killed. But when they reached the ravine's mouth and found the old drainage tunnel she'd memorized from a satellite feed no one else bothered to study, the disbelief turned into silence. It was their only path through. "You think it's clear?" one whispered. She checked her watch, scanned the ground for trip wires, and answered with quiet certainty. "It will be." Hours blurred into minutes. The team moved through darkness so thick even their night vision stuttered. Somewhere ahead, a faint glow flickered, enemy campfire light. The men froze. Jenna didn't. She dropped her pack, motioned for silence, and crawled forward on her belly until her face met the dirt lip overlooking the clearing. There were 6 of them, armed, relaxed, laughing. She could see the mortar tubes stacked behind them. That was their death sentence, right there. She whispered into the calm. "Mortars located. Southeast ridge. Engaging." Brooks hissed through the radio. "Negative, Cole. Hold your position." But Jenna didn't listen. She'd already slipped into the storm. The first explosion came sudden and surgical. A concussive blast lit the ravine as if the sun had decided to rise early. The echo rolled through the valley, scattering the enemy line. The SEALs ducked instinctively, shouting her name. But the only answer came through static, short bursts of gunfire, then silence. For 7 endless minutes, they waited, hearts pounding, every second a question mark. Then, through the smoke, a flare rose. 3 bright pulses, the Recon code for path clear. Brooks staggered upright, jaw slack. That's her," someone breathed. They pushed forward, following the light until they reached the ridge. What they found stopped them cold. The mortar site was gone, reduced to a smoking crater. Jenna sat slumped behind a shattered boulder, her left arm torn and bleeding, detonator still in her hand. She looked up, barely conscious, and smiled weakly. "Told you it'd be clear." They carried her back through the rain, quiet, almost reverent. No one spoke. Even Brooks, always loud, always sure, walked beside her stretcher without a word, eyes hollow from the realization of what he'd almost lost. By dawn, they reached the extraction point. Reinforcements found them huddled in the mud, exhausted but alive. All because the one they dismissed had refused to back down. Later, in the debrief tent, the brass called it a tactical recovery under extreme duress. The men called it something simpler. She saved our damn lives. But Jenna didn't show up to the commendation meeting. She was already gone, volunteering for another recon rotation. The commander tried to argue, but she just said, "The mission's not over. Not yet." And that's where the official reports end. But the recorder they found days later, the one that started this story, tells what really happened after the extraction call. Her voice was calm, barely above a whisper. "If you're hearing this," she said, "we made it out. Don't waste time writing this down as luck. It wasn't luck. It was preparation. It was listening when everyone else panicked. It was remembering that fear doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're alive enough to keep moving." Then there was a pause, wind howling against the mic, a single breath, and her final line. "Tell them courage wasn't the loudest voice out here. It was the quiet one that didn't stop." So the next time someone tells you bravery has a face, remember hers, the young woman who led a team of elite soldiers through a valley no one was supposed to survive. The one who turned certain death into one last chance to fight. Lieutenant Jenna Cole. The one who broke through. The storm didn't end that night, it only changed form. By the time the rain had stopped, the mountains had swallowed every sound of battle, leaving only the faint echo of thunder and the rasp of breath from exhausted soldiers who couldn't quite believe they were still alive. Lieutenant Jenna Cole stood at the edge of the ridge, her left arm bandaged with duct tape and gauze, her body trembling not from fear, but from the adrenaline she refused to let go of. Below her, the valley still smoked, the ground scarred with craters where the enemy mortars had been. The squad behind her waited for orders, too stunned to move without her signal. Commander Brooks leaned heavily on a crutch improvised from his rifle, watching her through the haze. The same man who had once told her to stand down and let the real soldiers handle it. Now, there was no trace of arrogance left, only awe, and a quiet shame that hung heavier than the mist. Jenna said nothing. She didn't need to. With a single hand gesture, she pointed to the path eastward, toward higher terrain, toward the way home. The trek took them through the most unforgiving ground they'd ever crossed. Mud thick as tar, roots like tripwires, every sound a warning. Twice they stopped to drag Brooks up when his injured leg buckled, and each time he tried to tell her to leave him, she ignored him with that same steady calm that had saved them all. "You don't get to quit now," she said the second time, tightening the straps on his vest. "You're going to live long enough to remember who got you out." There was no bitterness in her voice, no ego, only conviction, pure and unshakable. Hours passed, and when the first streaks of dawn touched the horizon, they finally saw the flicker of a signal flare far in the distance. Friendly forces sweeping the perimeter. Relief rippled through the group, soft laughter breaking like cracks in ice. But Jenna didn't smile. She was already studying the ridge behind them, where faint movement caught her eye, shadows where there shouldn't have been any. "We're not done," she said quietly. "They're regrouping." The others turned in disbelief. After last night, one whispered, "They're insane." Jenna reloaded her rifle, ignoring the sting of her torn arm. "They're desperate," she replied, "and desperate men are the most dangerous." She dropped her pack and moved forward again, scanning the terrain for choke points. This time, no one questioned her, not even Brooks. They fell into formation instinctively, letting her call the pace. The enemy's counterattack came fast, a barrage of fire slicing through the trees, dirt exploding around them as bullets shredded the branches overhead. One of the men went down instantly. Another froze in the open. Jenna didn't hesitate. She sprinted straight into the crossfire, grabbed the paralyzed soldier by the vest, and hauled him behind a rock wall as if strength had nothing to do with size. "You breathe, you fight, you live," she told him, shoving a spare mag into his trembling hands. "Do all three." When the radio crackled again, her voice was the only one that didn't break. "This is Recon 6, position Delta. We're holding. Send smoke on my mark." The response came through static. "Negative. You're too close to the blast zone." Jenna looked down the ridge at the advancing line of hostiles. Dozens of them, pushing hard, reckless, certain the Americans were finished. She keyed the mic again. "Then I'll make it close enough to matter." She dropped the handset, pulled the flare pin with her teeth and fired it high into the sky. A second later, the world erupted. The ridge lit up like sunrise, air filled with debris and fire as support rounds screamed into the enemy's advance. The shockwave hurled her backward, but she crawled to her knees, dazed, ears ringing, eyes stinging from smoke. Through the ringing, she heard the voice of one of her men. They're falling back. They're retreating. Jenna barely registered it. She was already counting heads, checking pulses, calling names. One missing, Private Landers. She turned before anyone could stop her and disappeared into the gray fog, where the ground still burned. "Cole!" Brooks shouted, trying to stand. But she was gone, swallowed by the chaos. The others waited, praying she'd reappear. Then, through the thick haze, a figure emerged, dragging Landers over her shoulder, coughing, barely upright. She stumbled the last few feet before collapsing beside the others, half laughing, half gasping. "Told you," she said, voice raw. "We're not dying here." Brooks knelt beside her, his voice low, unsteady. "Lieutenant," he said, "you saved my men. You saved me." She turned her head, eyes glazed with exhaustion but steady as ever. "No, sir. We saved each other. That's the difference." By the time evac finally arrived, the valley was quiet again, too quiet. The SEALs loaded into the helicopter one by one, and when the medic tried to pull Jenna aboard, she resisted for a moment, staring out at the landscape that had nearly buried them. "Every inch of this ground tried to kill us," she said softly, "and we still made it through." Then she climbed in. As the chopper lifted off, Brooks leaned across from her, still pale, still shaken. "Lieutenant," he said, "how did you know? How did you know where to strike, when to move?" She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, where sunlight finally touched the wreckage below. "You don't wait for the perfect moment," she murmured. "You make it." And with that, she closed her eyes, not to rest, but to remember the sound of silence after chaos, the moment when fear broke and resolve took its place. Hours later, when the debrief began, she refused to take credit. Every question was met with a variation of the same answer. "We followed the plan." When the general himself asked what drove her to keep fighting, she simply said, "Because someone had to." Her teammates, once skeptical, once dismissive, now couldn't look her in the eye without standing a little straighter. They had watched her break through, not with muscle, not with noise, but with precision, patience, and absolute clarity. She had been the calm in their chaos, the compass in their storm. And though they all left that mountain alive, none of them would ever forget what it cost. Were the woman who refused to surrender when even hope had called it quits. Weeks later, the desert dust had long settled, and the reports had all been typed, stamped, and filed away in the endless bureaucracy of war, yet something still lingered, something that no after-action summary could capture. The story of what happened in Koraz Valley had spread quietly, soldier to soldier, whispered between bases like a prayer disguised as rumor. Some called it luck, some called it madness, but the ones who were there called it what it truly was: leadership. The kind that didn't shout orders from behind a desk, but bled for every inch of ground gained. Lieutenant Jenna Cole walked through the recovery wing of the military hospital weeks later, her left arm still in a sling, her uniform crisp, her face calm. The nurses nodded respectfully when she passed, but she didn't notice. Her eyes were fixed on the window overlooking the training field, where a new batch of recruits jogged in formation under the morning sun. She had never cared much for ceremonies, but that morning was different. She had been summoned, though no one told her why. When she entered the briefing hall, the air changed. Dozens of officers stood at attention, their eyes following her as she made her way to the front. Commander Brooks, now walking with a brace on his leg, waited beside a small podium. He looked older somehow, humbled by survival, his once booming voice quieter, steadier. "Lieutenant Cole," he began, "on behalf of the United States Navy and the Recon Division, you are hereby awarded the Silver Star for extraordinary valor and decisive leadership under fire." A murmur rippled through the room, half respect, half disbelief that a woman so young, once dismissed as unproven, now stood before them as the reason they were still breathing. Brooks stepped back and saluted her, his voice tight with emotion. "You saved my team, Lieutenant. You saved me." Jenna accepted the medal, but her hands trembled, not from pride, but from the weight of all the names that wouldn't receive theirs because no one made it home to tell their story. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the silence, "I didn't do it for the medal." Brooks smiled faintly. "I know. That's why you deserve it." After the ceremony, she found herself alone again outside, the early afternoon heat pressing against her skin, the medal cold in her palm. For a long moment, she just stared at it, then slipped it into her pocket. She walked toward the memorial garden beyond the base, where small metal plaques gleamed beneath the sun, names etched into stone, reminders of those who hadn't made it back. She knelt by one marked with 3 simple words: Unknown Recon Unit. It was for those whose stories ended in silence. "You were right," she whispered softly, her gaze distant. "It's never about who gets remembered. It's about who keeps them alive." She placed her medal beneath the plaque and stood, brushing the dust from her knees. That night, back in her quarters, she unfolded a piece of paper she hadn't touched since the mission. It was the hand-drawn map from that valley, lines smeared, corners burned, still stained with the dirt of the ridge that nearly became their grave. On the back, she wrote a single sentence before folding it again. "Fear doesn't end courage, it reveals it." Then she tucked it into an envelope and left it on Brooks's desk with no name, no rank, no explanation. The next morning, he found it and said nothing, just read it twice and smiled the way men do when they finally understand what it means to follow. Months later, a new team arrived at the same base. Fresh faces, nervous laughter, eyes full of questions. Their instructor handed out the new field manual, revised and updated after the Karaz incident. Inside, one section stood out: Cole Protocol, Adaptive Recon Leadership under Hostile Confinement. None of the recruits knew who Cole was, but they would learn soon enough. Because out there, when the maps failed, when the radios died, when fear clawed at the edges of reason, her story was the one that kept them moving. The woman who broke through. The one who didn't wait for permission to survive. Years later, when the official archives were declassified, journalists would ask her for interviews, for headlines, for dramatized retellings. She turned them all down. She wasn't interested in fame or correction. She'd already seen what happens when the world turns bravery into spectacle. It forgets the quiet kind. The kind that bleeds in silence and stands back up anyway. So she disappeared into the quiet again, training new officers, walking the range at dawn, the hum of wind, and steel her only company. They said she smiled more now, but it wasn't pride, it was peace. And though her name would one day be carved into the Hall of Honor, right beneath the inscription "Courage Under Fire," it wouldn't be the medal or the title that people remembered. It would be the echo of her voice from that recorder, the words that had carried through the static long after the gunfire died. Courage isn't loud. It doesn't wait for applause. It just keeps moving. So when you hear her name, remember this: Jenna Cole didn't just survive the impossible. She rewrote what survival meant. Not by shouting louder, but by acting when everyone else froze. Not by chasing glory, but by leading when no one else could. She broke through the line, broke through fear, and in doing so, she broke through the limits they'd tried to put around her. And that's how legends are made. Not in medals, not in words, but in the moments when the world whispers, "You can't," and someone like her answers quietly, "Watch me."